Some people say the hardest thing about getting older is watching your body slow down. I used to believe that. Then I watched the people I had sacrificed everything for decide I was no longer worth a seat at their table, and I learned that the hardest thing about getting older is finally understanding you let it happen. My name is Margaret Caldwell, and for 31 years I was a high school English teacher in Millbrook, Virginia. I graded papers at midnight, drove an 11-year-old Buick with a cracked dashboard, and ate lunch at my desk 4 days a week so I could put money away for my daughter's future. I was not a woman who asked for much. I was a woman who gave. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below, and if this story speaks to you, please subscribe, because tomorrow I have something waiting for you that I think you'll want to hear. The moment that cracked something open inside me wasn't when my son-in-law first started treating me like an inconvenience. It wasn't even when I heard him tell my daughter behind the kitchen door that I was exhausting to be around. The moment that finally woke me up was a Tuesday evening in late October when he sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the table where I had helped my daughter with her homework, where we had eaten birthday cake and cried together after her father died, and told me, with remarkable calm, that I was not welcome at Thanksgiving. "We feel like the holiday would just flow better without you there," he said. "The kids are at an age where they pick up on tension, and honestly, Margaret, you're not exactly easy to be around." I remember staring at the centerpiece on the table. A small ceramic pumpkin I had bought at a craft fair the year my husband passed. I had heard those words and understood immediately that nothing would ever be the same, not because of the cruelty, though it was cruel, because I was sitting in my own home, and the man speaking to me was someone whose restaurant I had been quietly funding for 2.5 years. I did not cry. I did not argue. I said I understood and walked him to the door. And the following morning, before he had even driven home to tell my daughter what a reasonable conversation it had been, I called my bank. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it actually began. I grew up in Roanoke, one of 3 daughters, raised by a mother who cleaned hotel rooms and a father who drove a delivery truck. Money was not a subject we discussed openly in our house. It was a presence, like weather, something you worked around. I went to college on a scholarship, married a quiet and decent man named Gerald who taught middle school history, and we built a life together in Millbrook that was modest and full and good. Our daughter was born when I was 29. She was curious and stubborn and brilliant in the way that breaks your heart a little because you know the world is going to give her trouble for it. Gerald and I put everything into her education. When she wanted to take a summer writing program in New York at 17, I tutored students on weekends for 3 months to cover it. When she got into a university 4 hours away, we drove her there and wept in the parking lot the whole way home. Gerald died of a heart attack 6 weeks after her college graduation. He was 58. It was the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. It just removes the floor from under you and you spend the next several years learning how to stand on nothing. My daughter moved back to Millbrook for a year to be with me, and during that time, I watched her grieve in a way that was different from mine but just as total. She had loved her father without reservation. When she eventually returned to Richmond for work, I told her it was the right thing and meant it, even though my house had never felt so empty. She met her husband at a networking event in Richmond. He was in restaurant management, charming in the way that certain men are charming, which is to say, effortlessly and without much effort behind it. He had strong opinions about wine and very little patience for uncertainty, and from the first dinner we shared together, I understood that he was a man who arranged the world around his own preferences. My daughter loved him. That was the fact I kept returning to. She loved him, and she was happy. And I told myself that was what mattered. They married in a ceremony that his parents had strong opinions about, and I had a small role in planning. I was asked to handle the seating cards and coordinate the shuttle schedule for guests. His mother gave the toast at the rehearsal dinner. I smiled through all of it, because my daughter was radiant and I was not there to compete. I was there to celebrate her. What I did not fully understand in those early years was that my diminished role in the wedding was not a temporary accommodation. It was the template for what was coming. The restaurant idea came about 2 years into their marriage. My son-in-law had always talked about owning his own place, and one evening at dinner he laid out a plan with the confidence of a man who had never seriously failed at anything. He had found a location in a revitalizing neighborhood in Richmond. He had projections. He had a vision. What he did not have was enough capital. My daughter called me a week later. She was careful and measured the way she always was when she was about to ask me something that made her uncomfortable. She said they had looked at small business loans, but the interest rates were difficult, and if I was willing to co-sign and contribute a portion of the startup costs as an investment, they would make sure I was paid back as the business grew. I asked how much. She hesitated. $20,000 to start, she said, and they might need me to co-sign on a line of credit for the equipment. I was 61 years old and recently retired. I had my pension from the school district, Gerald's small life insurance payout, and savings that represented 30 years of careful, deliberate restraint. $20,000 was not a small number, but she was my daughter, and the restaurant was her husband's dream, and somewhere in that equation I found a version of the decision that felt like love. I said yes. The restaurant opened on a Thursday in March. It was a genuinely beautiful space, exposed brick and warm lighting, and a menu that leaned into seasonal Virginia ingredients. My daughter hosted the opening and was gracious and warm, the best version of herself. My son-in-law held court near the bar and accepted compliments like they were his natural inheritance. I sat at a corner table with one of my retired colleagues and ate a very good lamb chop and told myself I had made the right decision. For the first several months, things seemed to be working. My son-in-law called occasionally with updates, membership numbers, catering contracts, good reviews in local publications. My daughter seemed lighter, more energized. I visited Richmond every few weeks and occasionally ate at the restaurant on a Saturday night, though I noticed that my son-in-law rarely came to sit with me and always had somewhere else to be when I arrived. Then, about 8 months in, the calls from my daughter started changing in tone. The startup costs had been higher than projected. The kitchen equipment had required an unexpected repair. A key staff member had left, and the replacement cost more. Each time, she delivered the news with the careful neutrality of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. Each time, I found myself reaching back into my savings. By the time I stopped counting, I had contributed just over $43,000 beyond the original investment, on top of co-signing a business line of credit for $60,000. I had also, during one particularly difficult stretch, when the restaurant was between a good quarter and a bad one, quietly covered 2 months of their personal mortgage payment because my daughter mentioned, almost in passing, that things were tight. I did not tell her I had done that. I told myself it was because I did not want to add to her stress. Looking back, I think I already knew on some level that saying it out loud would require us to have a conversation I was not ready for. It was around this time that my son-in-law began making comments. They were small at first. A remark about how I always seemed to arrive at the wrong moment. A joke, delivered with that practiced smile of his, about how I had opinions on everything. Once, when I offered to help clear the table after Sunday dinner, he said, "We have a system, Margaret," with the particular tone of a man informing a child they are in the way. I adjusted. I visited less. I waited to be invited rather than suggesting visits myself. I bought gifts that I thought were thoughtful and watched them be received with the pleasant blankness of people who already have everything they want. My daughter noticed none of this, or perhaps she noticed and did not know what to do with it. She was busy. The restaurant consumed enormous energy, and when I spoke with her on the phone, her voice was always slightly somewhere else. Then came October. My son-in-law called me on a Tuesday and asked if he could stop by. He was in Millbrook for a supplier meeting and had an hour free. I made coffee and set out some cookies I had baked that weekend, because that is the kind of woman I am. I feed people. He sat at my kitchen table and accepted the coffee and then told me, with his hands folded neatly in front of him, that they had decided to spend Thanksgiving in Asheville with his family, just his immediate family and his parents and his brother's family. A smaller gathering this year, more relaxed. I said that sounded lovely. I asked if my daughter and the grandchildren would be there the week before or after. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man selecting his words from a prepared list. "The thing is, Margaret," he said, "we feel like some of our family time lately has felt a little heavy. The kids pick up on tension, and when you're around, there's just a certain energy. It's nothing specific. It's just better for everyone if this particular holiday is a bit more contained." He said it without malice, which I think was worse than if he had been angry. He said it the way you might explain to someone why their application had been declined. I told him I understood. I thanked him for coming by. I walked him to the door and stood in my entryway for a long time after his car disappeared down the street. The ceramic pumpkin was on the table behind me. The coffee cups were still on the table. The cookies sat on the plate, untouched by him. I had given this man's business more than $100,000, counting the line of credit I was responsible for. I had quietly covered payments and swallowed embarrassment and made myself smaller and smaller until apparently I was still not small enough. I went to my desk. I found the folder where I kept every financial document related to the restaurant, every transfer record, every co-signing agreement, every text message in which my daughter had asked for help and I had provided it. I had been keeping this folder out of habit, the habit of a woman who spent 31 years tracking every receipt in her classroom budget. I had not imagined I would ever need it for anything other than taxes. I read through it for about an hour. Then I called my banker and asked her to walk me through my options. The following morning, I called my attorney. His name was Paul Whitfield, and he had handled Gerald's estate and had the steady, no-nonsense manner of someone who had seen every variety of family complication and been surprised by none of them. I explained the situation, the investments, the co-signed debt, the verbal understandings about repayment. Paul listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about him. When I finished, he said, "First thing we need to do is check the status of that business line of credit." I knew what he meant before he finished the sentence. I drove to my bank that afternoon. The account representative who had helped me co-sign the line of credit pulled up the balance. She turned the screen toward me, and I read the number carefully. $57,400, drawn against a $60,000 limit. I asked when the last draw had occurred. 3 weeks earlier, $12,000. I sat with that number for a moment. 3 weeks earlier, my son-in-law had told my daughter the restaurant was having its best autumn to date. I paid off the balance that afternoon. The early penalties were significant. I did not care. Paul had been very clear. As a co-signer, I was equally liable for the debt. Whatever was happening with those withdrawals, I needed to be free of the exposure. I drove home, made myself dinner, and sat in the quiet of my house. I was not angry yet. I was something closer to clear. The particular clarity that comes when a thing you have been avoiding finally makes itself impossible to avoid. My daughter called that evening. She had heard from my son-in-law that I had seemed upset during his visit. She wanted to make sure I was okay. I told her I was fine. I told her I was making some decisions about my finances that were overdue. I kept my voice steady. She asked if everything was all right with the business account. I said she should probably have a conversation with her husband about the business account. There was a pause. Then she said she would, and we said goodnight. I did not hear from my son-in-law for 6 days. When he finally called, his voice had a different texture, still controlled, but with something running underneath it that was new. He said he had noticed the line of credit had been closed without any discussion. He said that was a significant unilateral action on my part. He used the word unilateral twice. I told him I was a co-signer on that account, which meant I had every legal right to pay it off and close it, and that I had done so because I was not comfortable with the exposure. He said the restaurant had been counting on that availability for operational flexibility. I asked what the $12,000 withdrawal 3 weeks earlier had been used for. He said equipment maintenance. I said I would be happy to see the invoice for the equipment maintenance. He said he would have his bookkeeper send it over. No invoice arrived. I spent the next 2 weeks methodically, not unhappily, getting my financial house in order. I had a second meeting with Paul, during which I asked about my options regarding the money I had given directly to the restaurant over the 2.5 years. Without a written loan agreement, Paul explained, the direct contributions were on uncertain legal ground. I could pursue a claim, but it would be expensive and difficult. What I could do was document everything I had and ensure that nothing further was at risk. I also, after a long quiet evening with a glass of wine and Gerald's old reading chair, called my financial advisor and updated my will. That is all I will say about that for now. I began calling friends I had let drift. Margaret from the history department, who had retired the same year I did and had been asking me to join her hiking group for 3 years. A woman named Carol from my church who organized a reading circle on Wednesday evenings and had twice invited me, and twice I had declined because I was tired from picking up extra tutoring sessions to supplement what I was sending south, toward Richmond. I said yes to both. The hiking group met on Saturday mornings at a trail that ran along the river south of town. The first Saturday I went, I arrived uncertain and slightly overdressed for the terrain, and within 40 minutes I was laughing harder than I had in 2 years at a story Margaret told about a wrong turn and a very opinionated goose. The cold air on my face felt like something returning to me. Meanwhile, my daughter grew quieter in our phone calls. I could hear her sifting through something privately, and I gave her space. I did not press. I had learned from long experience that she worked through difficult things in her own order, and that the most useful thing I could do was remain stable and available. Then one Friday evening, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, she called from a number I did not recognize. She said she was at a friend's house in Richmond. She said she needed to tell me something and she needed me to listen without reacting. I sat down. She told me that she had gone through the restaurant's accounts, not the summary reports her husband had been showing her, but the actual accounts, the source documents. She had done it after my comment about talking to him, because something in my voice that night had told her she needed to look. She had found a pattern of withdrawals over 14 months that did not correspond to any business expense she could identify. Not equipment, not supplies, not payroll. She had then, with the help of a friend who was a CPA, traced several of those withdrawals to a second account in her husband's name that she had not known existed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "There's a woman in Chapel Hill." I did not say anything. She said she had found reservation confirmations, hotel records, a recurring restaurant charge on the secret account that corresponded to weekends when he had told her he was at industry conferences. 14 months of it. My daughter was 41 years old and she was trying very hard not to cry on the phone, and I understood in that moment what all of those withdrawals had actually funded. Not the restaurant, not operational flexibility. A parallel life, paid for with money I had worked 31 years to save. I told her to listen to me carefully. I told her she had done nothing wrong, and that she had been lied to by someone who had practiced the deception long enough to make it seem seamless. I told her she was not going to go through this alone. She asked if she could come home. I had her room ready by the time she arrived. She came without the children that first weekend, just herself, and we sat at the kitchen table that had witnessed most of the important things in her life and talked until 2 in the morning. I made tea and did not attempt to fix anything, and mostly I just listened, which is the most useful thing one person can do for another who is in the middle of discovering that the map of their life was drawn incorrectly. She told me things I had not known, that the restaurant had been struggling more seriously than she had let on because she had been ashamed to tell me after everything I had already given, that her husband had convinced her the difficulties were temporary and manageable, and that his projections were sound, that she had believed him because she had wanted to and because the alternative was too large to look at directly. She also told me that she had found the business account statements from the period when I had paid off the line of credit and closed it. She had seen the balance at the time I paid it off. She had done the math. She looked at me and said, "Mom, he was going to let that debt sit there with your name on it." I told her I knew. She said, "He sat at your kitchen table and told you that you bring down the energy, and then he drove back to Richmond and withdrew money from an account you were liable for." I told her I knew that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry you were the one who had to pay for it. And I mean that in every sense." I reached across the table and held her hand. I told her that the money was money, and that she was my daughter, and that these were not comparable categories. In the weeks that followed, I watched her do something that required genuine courage. She hired a family attorney. She had a frank conversation with her in-laws, who were more shaken than I expected, and less defensive than I had feared. She began the process of separating 2 lives that had been tangled together for 8 years. Not because it was easy, but because the alternative was continuing to live inside a deception, and my daughter had too much of her father's honesty in her to do that. My son-in-law, to his credit, did not contest the fundamental facts when they were laid out by attorneys. He made attempts in the early weeks to frame his choices as symptoms of pressure and circumstance, which is a particular kind of explanation that manages to acknowledge the action while avoiding the responsibility. He eventually stopped making those arguments when it became clear that no one in the room was accepting them. The restaurant closed in January. It had been closer to the edge than anyone outside the accounting had understood. And once my son-in-law's financial management came under scrutiny, The picture that emerged was not the thriving business he had described at dinner parties. It was a vehicle that had been managed for appearances, propped up by credit and supplemented by cash that should have been going elsewhere. I attended my daughter's first attorney meeting with her, not because she needed me to speak for her, but because she asked me to be there. I sat to her right and said almost nothing, and watched her be clearer and more composed than I could have managed at her age, and I felt something I can only describe as complicated pride, the kind that carries grief inside it because you wish she had never needed to be this strong. Thanksgiving came and went quietly. My daughter and the grandchildren drove to Millbrook, and we made a smaller meal than usual. Just the four of us and Margaret from the hiking group, who had nowhere to be that year and brought a sweet potato pie that was legitimately the best thing I ate in the entire month of November. The grandchildren helped make biscuits, and we ate early and then watched a movie together on the couch, the older one asleep by 8, the younger one determined to make it to 9, and failing. It was not the Thanksgiving I would have chosen, but it was real in a way that I had been missing for longer than I had admitted. In December, something unexpected happened. There was a man in my Wednesday reading group, a retired civil engineer named Robert, who had moved to Millbrook 2 years earlier to be closer to his son's family after his wife died. He had white hair and reading glasses that he was always setting down in the wrong place, and he had opinions about Hemingway that were, in my professional assessment, incorrect, and he was not afraid to defend them. We had a disagreement about a short story one evening that went on well past when the group had moved on, and by the end of it, we had discovered that we were both the kind of people who did not change their minds easily, but genuinely enjoyed meeting someone else who didn't either. He asked if I wanted to get coffee the following week and continue the argument. I said yes before I had thought about whether to say yes, which is unusual for me and which felt, in itself, like information. We had coffee, then we had lunch. Then one Saturday, he joined the hiking group, and Margaret from the history department took me aside afterward and informed me with great satisfaction that he had very nice posture and had clearly been looking for any opportunity to walk beside me on the trail, which I had in fact noticed and had chosen not to comment on. By February, I was willing to describe him to my sister as a person I was seeing, which at 63 felt both slightly ridiculous and entirely appropriate, the way many of the truest things feel. I want to tell you what happened at the community center one Tuesday evening in March, because I think it is the part of this story that actually matters most. There is a support group that meets at the Millbrook Community Center for families dealing with financial exploitation within relationships. I had started attending in January, mostly because Paul, my attorney, had suggested it, and I had found, somewhat to my own surprise, that other people's clarity helped me maintain mine. I had eventually been asked to share my experience, briefly, at one of the meetings. I told them a condensed version of what I have told you. I told them about the years of quiet giving, about believing that love required me to become progressively smaller, about the line of credit and the October, Tuesday, and what it had finally taken to make me understand that I had confused enabling with devotion. Afterward, a woman approached me. She was perhaps 55, with the careful, controlled posture of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time. She said her brother had been borrowing money from her for 6 years. She had stopped 3 months ago, and he had not spoken to her since. She wanted to know if it got easier. I thought about my daughter at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, brave in a way I hoped she never needed to be again. I thought about the reading group and the hiking trail and Robert with his Hemingway opinions and his misplaced glasses. I thought about the porch where I now drank my coffee every morning, without calculating what I was going to have to give up to fund someone else's choices. I told her the truth, that it does not get easier all at once, that there are mornings when you wake up and the grief of it sits right there waiting, but that each small choice you make that puts your own life back in the center of your own life, those accumulate, they become a new foundation, and eventually you realize that the floor you thought you lost was not the floor at all. The floor is something you build yourself, one decision at a time. She nodded and pressed my hand, and I understood from the way she did it that she had needed to hear exactly that and nothing more. I am writing this in early spring, sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee. The dogwood in my yard is beginning to bloom. In an hour, I am meeting Robert at the farmer's market, where there is a woman who sells the best goat cheese I have ever eaten, and this has become one of our Saturday rituals, which is a quiet miracle I intend to protect carefully. My daughter is in the process of rebuilding, Her divorce will be final before summer. She has started consulting for a marketing firm and has a small apartment that she has made genuinely hers. Her books on every shelf, her photographs on every wall, her name only on the lease. She calls me most evenings and we talk about ordinary things, what the grandchildren said, what she is reading, what we are each making for dinner. These conversations are not weighted with obligation or careful navigation. They are just us, talking, the way we talked before everything got complicated. She asked me once, not long ago, if I regretted any of it. The money, the years, the choices I made that I cannot undo. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told her I regretted some of it. I regret not asking for a written agreement from the beginning, not because I am a suspicious person, but because clarity on paper protects the relationship as much as the money. I regret not speaking up the first time I felt diminished, because silence teaches people what you will accept. I regret waiting until I was sitting across from a man at my own kitchen table, a man I had subsidized for 2.5 years, and being told I was too heavy a presence for a family holiday, before I finally understood that I had been negotiating against myself for a very long time. But I do not regret stopping. I do not regret making that phone call the morning after he left my house. I do not regret the look on Paul's face when I came in with a folder that documented everything, because a woman who has been a teacher for 31 years keeps very good records. I do not regret the person I have become in the months since, which is, I believe, a closer version of the person I was always supposed to be. You teach what you most need to learn. I told students for decades that the most important sentence a person can learn to say is the one that accurately represents what they mean, that words have weight and should be chosen accordingly, that a story, to be true, has to tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. I should have applied those lessons to my own life much earlier, but I am applying them now, which is not nothing, which is, in fact, everything. If you are watching this and you recognize any piece of what I have described, I want to say something to you directly. The money, whatever form it takes, is not the point. The money is just where the imbalance becomes visible. The real question is whether the people you love treat you like a person whose presence has value that has nothing to do with what you provide. Whether they make room for you in their lives not because you are useful but because you matter to them. Whether they would show up for you if the resources disappeared. Those questions have answers. Sometimes the answers hurt. But they are better known than unknown, because you cannot build a real life on a foundation made of things you have decided not to look at. The dogwood is fully open now. I am going to finish my coffee. And then I am going to go meet a man at a farmer's market and argue very pleasantly about cheese and probably about literature and maybe about nothing in particular, which is its own kind of luxury, the luxury of ordinary mornings that belong entirely to yourself. I stood my ground. It cost me things I am still counting. And it gave me back my life. I will take that trade every time. Up next, I've saved 2 more stories on your screen that I think you'll want to hear. If this one stayed with you, don't let those pass you by.